She was a millionaire CEO, elegant, untouchable, and feared in boardrooms. He was just a janitor with a quiet strength, and a daughter who saw the world differently. But when her credit card failed in public, it was the little girl who stood up and did something no one saw coming. What happened next changed all three of their lives. If you believe kindness still has the power to transform lives, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul Moment Story, where every story is a quiet reminder that the human spirit can still surprise us. Now, let the story begin. In the heart of Boston's financial district, nestled between glass towers and old brick facades, Le Mont Bleu shimmered with evening elegance. Golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over linen-draped tables, and the hum of quiet conversations floated above the clinking of crystal. At the center table, 7 always reserved, always revered, sat Catherine Wynne, the woman whose name alone could silence a boardroom. Dressed in a sapphire silk dress that complemented her icy poise, Catherine didn't just own her seat, she owned the room. Her reputation as a fearless, self-made millionaire CEO preceded her. People whispered stories about how she once fired 3 executives during a champagne toast, smiling the entire time. Tonight she dined alone with only her phone and a half-sipped glass of wine for company. The server approached with practiced deference, sliding the bill into a leather folder and offering it with both hands. Catherine barely glanced at the total. She retrieved her platinum credit card, a card that symbolized prestige, status, certainty, and slid it across the table without a word. Beep. The silence that followed the failed transaction wasn't just audible, it was deafening. The server frowned, tried again. Beep. He looked up, his eyes flickering with hesitation. "I'm sorry, Miss Wynne. It seems—" "Try again." She cut him off the edge in her voice, sharpened by disbelief. Her posture remained elegant, but something in her expression cracked, an imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth, a flicker of something that hadn't visited her in years. Panic. Beep. This time the machine itself seemed reluctant to participate. The server looked mortified. Around them conversations slowed. Eyes turned. Whispers began. A ripple of curiosity spread through the room like a breeze before a storm. Near the back of the restaurant by the window, a small booth was occupied by a man who looked like he belonged to another world. Harris, tall, lean, dressed in a worn U.S. Army field jacket that had seen better decades, he sat with quiet dignity, his calloused hands carefully slicing a piece of chicken breast. Across from him sat a girl no older than 9, with hazel eyes that held galaxies, and a white cardigan slightly too big for her frame. Her name was Ava. She had been watching, not out of rudeness, but because she noticed everything. It was one of her many gifts. When the third beep echoed through the restaurant, Ava slid out of her seat. "Dad," she said softly. Already stepping away, "I'll be right back." Harris looked up, his brow folding. Ava, but she was already walking confidently, purposefully toward the center of the restaurant, where Catherine Wynne now sat, frozen, trying to pretend this wasn't happening. The server looked relieved to have a distraction. Ava stopped in front of the table, hands clasped in front of her. "Excuse me," she said politely. "You dropped this." She extended a small white envelope, old, but clean, neatly folded. Catherine blinked, confused. She hadn't dropped anything. And yet the girl's eyes were so sincere, so calm, that she instinctively reached for it. The envelope was light, almost empty. Inside was a single folded napkin. Catherine opened it. On it, in childlike cursive, read, "Everyone needs help sometimes. It's not weakness, it's grace. Ava." She looked up, stunned. What is this?" Ava simply smiled. "My dad says sometimes we're the witnesses, other times we're the ones being witnessed." And just like that, she turned and walked away. People who had been watching now pretended not to. But the energy had changed. Catherine stared at the napkin, then at the girl, then at the man in the booth, the father who gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, like a soldier saluting a fallen comrade. Power had shifted, not in dollars, not in status, but in dignity. The CEO who had built empires and made headlines sat momentarily speechless because a 9-year-old just reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years, humility, and something dangerously close to hope. The server, still unsure what to do, leaned in. "Ms. Wynne, would you like me to try another card?" Catherine folded the napkin, gently sliding it back into the envelope like it was made of glass. "No," she said. "I think I've just been paid." In full, she stood, walked toward the booth. Each step silenced more of the restaurant. When she reached them, she looked down at Harris. "I don't believe we've met," she said, voice steady but softer than it had been all night. "I'm Catherine." Harris looked up, calm as still water. "I'm Harris, and this is Ava." Catherine glanced at the girl who grinned, then returned to her half-eaten mashed potatoes. "I think your daughter just changed my night," Catherine said with the kind of honesty that feels new on the tongue. Harris gave a half smile. "She does that sometimes." There was a pause. Then Catherine asked, "Would you mind if I joined you for a few minutes?" Harris tilted his head slightly, as if weighing something deeper than manners. "Only if you're okay with mashed potatoes," he said. And just like that, the most powerful woman in the room sat down, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a human. The world outside kept spinning, but inside that small booth by the window, something had shifted permanently. A girl had done the unthinkable, and 3 lives would never be the same again. By dawn, the city of Boston stirred quietly, its skyscrapers still sleeping beneath the early mist, while streetlights blinked against the first touch of sun. Somewhere between the rhythm of morning footsteps and the hiss of espresso machines, Harris Hale had already begun his day. He moved through the back corridor of Le Mont Bleu like a shadow boots, silent on polished tile toolbox in hand. The uniform he wore wasn't regulation anymore. A faded green work shirt, sleeves rolled up, name patch long since torn. But it didn't matter. Harris had never needed titles to carry presence. He was the kind of man people stepped aside for, without knowing why. To most, he was the maintenance guy, polite, efficient, unremarkable. But no one knew that Harris Hale had once advised 4-star generals in Kandahar, that he could disassemble a field communication array blindfolded, or that the scars running from his shoulder to his ribcage weren't from any accident. They were from a night that still visited him in fragments thick with smoke and screams. He never talked about it, not with co-workers, not even with Ava. But it lived in him in the way he kept his tools sharp, his words measured, and his daughter safe. The hero's wound. People thought wounds were always visible. Harris knew better. His came in silence, in the dreams he never spoke of, in the way he sometimes paused before crossing an open space, eyes scanning rooftops out of habit. But Ava. She was the one thing that pulled him back from the edge every time. She was the reason he smiled in the morning, the reason he carried hope in a world that had once burned it to the ground. That afternoon, Catherine Wynne returned to the restaurant not for a reservation, but under the pretense of checking on a potential partnership. She told herself it was business. She needed to speak with the manager, evaluate the place. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was searching for him, the man with the eyes that held more history than words, and the girl who'd offered her grace in an envelope. She didn't ask for names. She simply wandered, looking until she found the staff lounge door slightly ajar. And there, through the narrow crack, she saw it. A moment she would never forget. Harris sat at a break table, legs crossed, a pencil in hand. Ava was next to him, curled up with a worksheet covered in complex equations. He leaned in, whispering something gently. Then he said, clearly and calmly, "Now en français, sweetheart. Comme on a pratiqué." Ava grinned, unfazed by the shift in language, and responded in flawless French, walking through the entire problem aloud. Catherine's breath caught. This wasn't just a single dad helping with homework. This was extraordinary. Who were they? She stepped back before they could see her retreating silently down the hallway, shaken in the most unexpected way. The man with the old uniform and calloused hands had just taught his daughter calculus in French, and not like a man showing off, but like someone who lived this, quietly, without fanfare. It rewrote everything she assumed. He wasn't some broken veteran struggling to get by. He was choosing simplicity. Catherine had built her life believing people were either power players or obstacles, assets or risks. You didn't survive in the boardroom with sentiment. But here was a man who had nothing by society's standards, and yet radiated a kind of strength that couldn't be measured in wealth or headlines. Later that evening, Harris closed up his tool chest in the back hallway, ready to pick up Ava from her part-time art class nearby. He turned the corner, and there she was. Catherine. Waiting. Not dressed in her usual sharp heels and tailored power suit. Tonight she wore jeans and a navy coat. Simple. Soft. Almost approachable. "I didn't expect to see you again," Harris said, voice low but not unkind. Catherine offered a small smile. "I wasn't sure I'd come back." A beat passed between them. Then she added, "I saw you with Ava today." He tensed just slightly. "You teach her math." "In French," she asked to learn. I obliged. His answer was matter-of-fact. No boasting, no humility, just truth. "She's gifted," Catherine said. "She's my heart," Harris replied. "Everything else is just logistics." Catherine looked at him. Truly. Looked. Not as a CEO examining a resume, but as a woman standing in the presence of something she couldn't quite name yet, but felt. Harris noticed the pause, then shifted the weight of his bag. "If you're curious why my card wouldn't bounce, I don't keep one." She blinked. "You don't believe in banks. I believe in simplicity. Less noise, more clarity." Catherine chuckled unexpectedly. "You talk like a monk, Marine, actually," Harris said with a faint smile. That smile stayed with her long after he walked away. That night, Catherine sat in her penthouse surrounded by glass, metal, and silence. The skyline glittered around her like a crown, but it felt hollow. She poured a glass of wine and unfolded the napkin Ava had given her again. Everyone needs help sometimes. It's not weakness, it's grace. Catherine had conquered markets, outbid titans, stood alone at the top of the ladder. But this unexpected encounter with a veteran and his daughter had undone something inside her. Not in a painful way, in a freeing one. Because for the first time in years, she realized power isn't about dominance, it's about dignity. And perhaps, redemption comes not through grand gestures, but through quiet echoes, like a whisper in French, between a father and his daughter, or the grace offered by a child in the middle of a crowded restaurant. The next afternoon, Catherine Wynne sat at her favorite corner booth in Le Mont Bleu, a steaming cup of matcha untouched before her. She wore a slate-gray blazer over a cream blouse perfectly polished as always, but her fingers drummed faintly on the table. The platinum card incident still echoed in her mind. It wasn't about the money. Her team had already explained the banking glitch and assured her it was resolved. It was the moment. The silence, the judgment in the air, and the child. That small voice carrying something larger than any boardroom she'd ever walked into. Ava. Catherine leaned back, her eyes scanning the dining room. There she was, again curled up in the same chair legs, swinging lightly as she read a thick, hardbound book at the bar counter while waiting for her father to finish repairing a faulty light panel. The book's cover read, Les Misérables, in French. Catherine blinked. She approached slowly, and cleared her throat. That's a heavy read for a... What 10-year-old Ava looked up. Her eyes were the kind that saw through, not at. Kind, but not naive. I'm 9, she said, smiling. But Hugo's French is easier to understand than his sadness. Catherine raised an eyebrow, trying to hide her surprise. Do you read it often? Only twice. I wanted to compare it to the English and Spanish versions. The translations change the meaning sometimes. That made Catherine sit down. No invitation was offered. None was needed. She studied the child in front of her scuffed sneakers, a second-hand sundress curls pulled into a simple braid. No designer labels. No prep school posture. Just clarity and calm. You speak Spanish too? Catherine asked. Si. And some Italian. But I mix it with French sometimes. Papa says that's normal when the brain's still organizing. Catherine tried to smile. What school do you go to? Ava tilted her head. The Boston Public Library. Excuse me? We don't do traditional school. Papa says learning is everywhere if you pay attention. He used to teach me from his old military field manuals, but I like the classics better. It was a statement so casual, so unpolished, that Catherine felt a strange tightening in her chest. This child wasn't performing. She was just being. You seem very perceptive, Ava. The girl gave a small shrug. I observe a lot. People think kids don't see things, but we do. Like yesterday. You were embarrassed when your card didn't work. Catherine stiffened. The air between them shifted. I wasn't embarrassed, she said, her tone sharpening just slightly. It was a technical error. Ava nodded thoughtfully. Sure, but you smiled too fast after. And when people smile fast like that, it's usually because they're scared someone saw behind it. Catherine wasn't used to being read, especially not by a child. There was no mockery in Ava's voice, no arrogance, just quiet awareness, like she had learned to listen to the world in ways most people forgot how. Before Catherine could respond, Harris appeared at the far end of the dining room, wiping his hands with a cloth tool belt slung low. He gave Ava a look that said, "Time to go," and she gently closed her book. "Nice talking to you, Ava," said, sliding off the bar stool. "Don't worry about the card thing. Everyone's allowed a bad day, even really rich people." Then she walked away. That evening, Catherine sat in the back seat of her town car, the city blurring past her window. But her mind wasn't on spreadsheets or investor meetings. It was on a child who read Hugo in French, corrected her Spanish tenses, and saw through her executive composure like it was glass, and who thought the public library was the best school in the world. She asked herself questions she hadn't asked in years. Why did that matter to me? Why does that little girl feel like a mirror I didn't know I needed? Back at her penthouse, she poured a glass of wine, then stopped halfway through. She pulled out her phone instead and began typing an email to her assistant. Subject line, "Cancel interview with Ridgefield Prep." Body. No need to follow up on Ava Hale. She doesn't go there. She deleted the message, then typed again. Subject, find out more about Harris Hale. She paused again, deleted it. Instead, she simply sat down in her reading chair, opened her own copy of Les Misérables, and for the first time in months, turned off her phone. The next day, Catherine waited outside Le Mont Bleu after closing hours. She had no plan, no pitch, only the pull of something unfinished. Harris exited the staff door with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, Ava skipping beside him. When they saw her, Harris tensed just slightly, but Ava offered a curious smile. "Miss Catherine," she greeted. "Hello, Ava." Harris. He nodded politely. Ms. Wynne, I just wanted to say thank you. For the other day. Ava shrugged. You're welcome. Catherine hesitated, then added, and I wanted to ask if you'd let me treat you both to dinner. As a thank you. Harris looked down at Ava. She whispered, just loud enough. Papa, you always say good manners include saying yes to kindness. Harris gave a small, defeated smile. One meal, he said. Deal. Catherine answered, her voice lighter than she'd intended. But as they walked down the street together, her in heels, Harris in old boots, and Ava skipping between them, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not control, not power, but presence. And in that small, quiet shift, something in her began to change. The elevator doors opened on the 47th floor with a soft chime. Harris Hale stepped out dressed as plainly as ever, old khaki trousers, his faded marine field jacket, and a canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder. He looked out of place against the high-gloss marble floors and minimalist luxury of Wynn Global's headquarters, but he carried himself with the calm of a man who had nothing to prove. At the end of the hallway, Catherine Wynne stood waiting at her glass-walled executive suite, tailored navy suit, tablet in hand. She offered a small, formal smile. Mr. Hale, she said, holding the door. Thank you for coming. He nodded. I'm not used to private elevators. She offered a tight chuckle. Few are. Please have a seat. Her office was expansive with sweeping views of downtown Boston, but Harris's eyes weren't on the skyline. Instead, he walked toward the modest reading nook tucked into the corner, where a shelf of well-worn books stood out among all the sleekness. He gently set down his bag beside the chair. You said this was about the restaurant maintenance schedule, he asked. Catherine cleared her throat. That. And more. She crossed to her desk and picked up a hardcover book, its edges marked with tiny sticky notes and underlines in pen. She held it out to him. I wanted to thank you, she said, for your kindness and your daughters. She paused. This is something I wrote years ago. Before the IPOs, before the boardrooms. It's called The Resilient Mind. A bit academic, but I've read it, Harris said, surprising her. Twice. Ava made me annotate it. That made her laugh, an honest one this time, catching even her off guard. Harris opened the book to a random page where one of her quotes was underlined. True leadership begins with listening to those who have nothing to gain. She liked that one, he said, closing the cover gently. Said you might have been a good Marine. Catherine sat across from him, studying him more carefully now. And you? What do you think Harris didn't flinch? I think you write better than you allow yourself to live. The words hung in the air, not unkind, just unfiltered. She should have been offended, but instead, something inside her softened. I invited you up here, she said, because I have access to things schools grants investors. I could open doors for you and Ava. Harris didn't answer immediately. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small, battered tin box. It looked like something a child might use for crayons, rusted edges, dents the latch barely holding. He opened it. Inside were stacks of yellowed index cards, each one filled with neat handwritten notes. Catherine leaned in. These were from my time overseas, he explained. Every strategy briefing, every negotiation, every moral gray zone they asked me to color in. I kept the ones that mattered. Catherine picked one up. The ink had faded in places. Trust is built by listening longer than it's comfortable. Below it, Fallujah, 2006. Why keep these, she asked. Because the world forgets. But if we forget with it, we lose more than memory. We lose compass. He took the card back, returned it to the box, and closed the lid. I don't need money, Ms. Wynne. Ava and I were okay. But she does need to see that what matters can't be bought, that kindness isn't charity, and that her worth isn't measured by what doors open when a CEO says her name. Catherine didn't speak. For once, she had no boardroom comeback, no executive posture to lean into. He stood. "I'll keep the book," he said quietly. "She'll want to quote it back at me during dinner." Then, without asking, he left the tin box on her coffee table. Catherine stared after him as he walked out. That night, long after the building had emptied, Catherine sat alone in her office. Her heels were off legs folded beneath her on the sofa. The tin box remained on the table before her unopened. She didn't touch it. She just looked at it. There was something about the worn edges, the stubborn latch, the smell of old paper and rusted memory that felt truer than anything in her entire sleek, modern life. She glanced toward her shelf of awards, Forbes covers, glass plaques, a photo with the Secretary of Commerce. None of them made her feel as seen as she had sitting across from Harris Hale. Not because he admired her, but because he didn't need to. The next morning, her assistant nearly tripped, rushing into the office. "Ma'am, there's a situation," she said. "The Boston Herald is running a story about you, something about your card being declined at Le Mont Bleu. It's gaining traction." Catherine waved her off. "Let them run it." "Are you sure I'm not defined by plastic?" she replied. But her eyes drifted toward the tin box again. She hadn't opened it yet. And maybe she wouldn't. Maybe it was never meant to be opened. Maybe it was simply meant to remind her that beneath the surface of every person, even the quiet janitor, with a daughter who reads Les Miserables in French, there are depths we'd never dare to map unless we sit long enough. And listen. Catherine Wynne stood at the window of her high-rise office, arms crossed tightly, as if bracing against an invisible storm. Outside, the Boston skyline gleamed under a soft late-morning sun, oblivious to the silent collapse happening within its glass towers. Behind her, 3 screens glowed on the conference table, red lines, declining graphs, emergency emails, and a terse message from her CFO. "They've shorted us again. This isn't market fluctuation, it's targeted." She'd built Wynn Global from the ground up, fought in rooms where she was the only woman, the youngest mind, the loudest silence. But now, her silence was dread. Her billion-dollar empire was slipping sabotaged by a network of rivals who knew exactly where to wound her. Her phone buzzed. Another missed call from the board chair. She didn't answer. Instead, she slumped into the leather chair at the end of the table and let her hands fall into her lap. Her blazer felt too tight, her mind too loud, her breath too shallow. A knock at the door. Before she could respond, it opened slightly, and a small voice peeked through. Miss Catherine Ava's head appeared, followed by the rest of her, holding a cloth bag and wearing a mismatched pair of socks. "I brought lunch," the girl chirped. "Dad made turkey wraps, with extra mustard. He said you look like someone who wouldn't be afraid of mustard." Catherine blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Ava, sweetheart, this really isn't." But the girl had already padded across the room and laid the food out carefully on the table, like setting up a school picnic. Then she noticed the screens. "Oof, that's a lot of red," Ava said. Catherine forced a smile. "Just adult stuff." Ava didn't pry. She sat down, pulled out a Sudoku puzzle book from her tote, and started working silently, munching on a carrot stick. Catherine turned her gaze back to the screens. The pattern of the attack was ruthless strategic sell-offs, misinformation leaks, and somehow someone had accessed internal projections. Every counteraction she deployed was too late or preempted. It wasn't just market aggression. It was betrayal. Miss Catherine, Ava said, frowning. "This puzzle doesn't work." "What do you mean? I've done the math 4 times. There's no way to solve it without repeating a 6 in this column." "See," she pointed. Catherine leaned over. "That can't be right. Sudoku puzzles have only one solution." I know, Ava said, tapping the grid. But look, row 5 and column 3 both have 6s, and there's no other spot for the third one. That means this was put together wrong. Somebody changed it. Catherine blinked. Suddenly, something clicked. She turned slowly toward her financial report. The spreadsheet they'd received from their data analytics vendor last week, one they'd used to secure a refinancing package, had an irregularity, a series of numbers that had seemed just slightly off. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up the file eyes darting across the columns. Then she opened the original database she'd saved weeks earlier. She placed them side by side. The difference was microscopic. One data row had been altered just enough to misrepresent the company's cash flow projections, enough to trigger an audit delay, enough to cause panic among shareholders, enough to look like her mismanagement. She turned to Ava, heart pounding. "You just saved my company." Ava blinked. "I did. You did." Catherine stood up, adrenaline replacing exhaustion. She opened her secure internal server, began cross-referencing login timestamps, and within minutes found a breach. Internal. Buried under admin credentials belonging to a contractor connected to her competitor. She called her CTO, lock the server, pull every IP log from the last 30 days. "I have the breach point," and call legal, we're filing charges. She hung up, then turned to Ava, who was calmly finishing her juice box. "How did you see that?" The little girl shrugged. "I like puzzles." Catherine knelt in front of her, looking directly into those curious, steady eyes. "You're not just a smart girl, Ava. You're rare." Ava beamed. "Dad says I'm a question mark with legs." Catherine laughed, a genuine released from prison kind of laugh. "Then promise me," Catherine said, "don't ever let this world turn you into an exclamation point." Later that evening, Catherine stood outside the maintenance wing of the restaurant where it had all begun. She knocked on the door gently. Harris answered, a wrench in one hand, grease on his forearm. "I owe you 2 dinners and an apology," Catherine said. He raised an eyebrow. "She found a flaw in a report that uncovered corporate espionage," she explained. "You raised a world-class auditor and didn't even know it." Harris gave the faintest smile. "She's been solving puzzles since she was 4. Said the world speaks in patterns. People just stop listening." "She listened," Catherine said, voice softer now. "And she helped me listen too." There was a pause. "Can I take you both out this weekend?" she asked. "Somewhere that doesn't serve turkey wraps." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Only if Ava picks the place." The air in Catherine Wynn's penthouse office crackled with urgency. Boston's skyline blinked below like a grid of fragile possibilities. She stood by the glass wall, arms crossed, jaw set. Her executive team had scattered hours ago, defeated, shaken, some unwilling to admit just how close they were to collapse. But Catherine was not finished. On the far end of the room, seated in a leather guest chair, with a posture that was too composed for the chaos around him, Harris Hale remained silent. He wore his janitor's uniform, old boots, calloused hands clasped in his lap. "You didn't bring me up here to fix a leak," Harris finally said, voice calm, low. Catherine turned to face him. "No, I brought you here because I don't trust anyone else." That made him blink. She walked toward the table and tapped the iPad in front of him. A presentation loaded data flows, acquisition routes, stock manipulation patterns. "These are the enemy's moves," she said. "I've been trying to counter them. But it's like I'm playing checkers, and they're playing war games." "I told you once," Harris said quietly. "I don't do strategy anymore." Catherine stepped closer. "That's not what I saw when you explained fiscal probabilities to your daughter using chess metaphors, or when she translated that legal brief from French faster than my in-house interpreter, or when you told her to stay calm and let the data speak. That's parenting, not consulting. No, that's leadership." Silence stretched between them like a loaded spring. I want you as a temporary partner, Catherine said. 1 week, 1 board meeting. Sit beside me as an advisor, not as a favor, not as an employee on paper, as an equal. I'll compensate you properly. I'll arrange logistics. You won't be alone. Harris shook his head, slow and final. I have a daughter, a life we've built around peace and silence. I've walked away from war, Catherine, even the kind that wears suits. She didn't try to convince him, just gave a small nod and said with sincerity, "Thank you for listening." He stood. I hope you find someone who sees it all the way through. That night, back in their modest apartment above a quiet bookstore, Harris sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. The evening breeze rustled the curtains. Ava was humming in the next room, organizing her books. Then came a soft knock. She peeked in, holding a glass jar filled with coins, crumpled bills, and a few foreign notes from Harris's time overseas. "I want to help," she said, simply placing it in his lap. He looked at her, stunned. "Where did you get it's my college jar?" But college can wait. Miss Catherine needs help now, right? And she helped us. I just thought. She hesitated. You always told me that real soldiers don't walk away from good people. Harris didn't respond. Ava climbed into bed beside him, curling under his arm like she had when she was 4 and afraid of thunderstorms. After a long pause, she whispered, "You don't have to wear the uniform, Dad. You just have to be who you are." Montage. Transformation begins. Morning light spills into the apartment. Harris opens the closet. Dust floats as he reaches past old tools and finds a tailored shirt from years ago still folded in plastic. Ava stands on a stool, adjusting her dad's tie with far too much concentration. "You look like one of those spy guys," she teases. Harris checks himself in the mirror. His stance is different, taller, grounded. A scar on his temple catches the light, but he doesn't look away. Cut to Catherine waiting near her car. She watches through the window as Harris steps out of the building with Ava beside him. Something unspoken shifts in her eyes, a quiet reverence. They nod at each other. No words, just a shared understanding. The conference room at Win Global that afternoon was a fortress of tension. Executives, investors, and legal counsel filled the space, the energy brittle. Then the doors opened. Harris entered. But this wasn't the man they knew as the janitor. This was the man who once advised field generals, who could read human behavior like topography, whose quiet was not absence, but control. He took his seat beside Catherine at the head of the table. A collective hush fell. She tapped her fingers once and looked at the group. "This is Harris Hale," she said. "You will listen to him like you listen to me." Some raised brows. One man scoffed, until Harris spoke. "I've reviewed the internal sabotage, the cash flow manipulations, and the projected cascade failures, if left unaddressed. You have 72 hours before this company becomes a cautionary tale in a business school textbook." He clicked the first slide. "And I intend to stop that from happening." Back at home that night, Ava waited up wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide as her dad walked through the door. She jumped up and ran to him. "How was it? Did you do the spy voice?" Harris grinned, lifting her into a hug. "We made a plan. We start tomorrow. And Miss Catherine said you're invited to the office library." Ava gasped. "The one with the revolving shelves?" "Only if you wear shoes this time," he said with mock sternness. She giggled. And for the first time in years, Harris felt not the weight of war, but the quiet beginning of something that just might heal. The boardroom of Win Global towered like a glass cathedral above Boston. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the sleek mahogany table. 11 board members sat in rigid formation, each holding tablets, pens, or skepticism. At the head of the table, Catherine Wynne sat, silent, poised. She wore no makeup today. Her signature navy power suit was replaced with a softer gray. She wasn't trying to impress them, not anymore. She was here to fight. And beside her, adjusting the single-button cuff of a navy blue blazer Ava had insisted he borrow, sat Harris Hale, the janitor, the ex-Marine, the man no one had expected. He was calm, too calm, and that unnerved them more than a loud entrance ever could. Across the room, Preston Vaughn, lead board member, and Catherine's most vocal critic, cleared his throat. "We've all reviewed the numbers, Catherine. Unless you've brought a miracle in a briefcase, this company's liquidity crisis is beyond salvage without liquidation." Another member chimed in. "Your silence is troubling. And frankly, this is insulting." "Who is this man?" Catherine didn't speak. Harris did. "I'm no miracle," he said, voice level. "And I didn't come with a briefcase." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered tin box, the same one Catherine had glimpsed in his apartment, filled with old military memos and hand-drawn tactical maps. He set it gently on the table like a relic. "But I have seen war. And I've seen betrayal dressed in boardroom suits." Murmurs flared. Preston scoffed. "What is this, a metaphor?" "No," Harris replied. "It's a blueprint." He stood unhurried and walked to the digital whiteboard. With precise hands, he began drawing over the company's projected downfall curve. 3 weeks ago, a financial anomaly appeared in your balance sheets, subtle enough to be brushed off, loud enough to be traced. Whoever engineered it did so, banking on your faith in data, not your instinct. A slide flipped Ava's annotated Sudoku puzzle, now decoded into a pattern of offshore transactions. Ava found this while solving a game. Harris continued. "She doesn't know what it means. But I do." He turned back to the board. "This company isn't failing. It's being bled." You could hear the collective inhale of disbelief. Preston pushed back. "You're making serious accusations without proof. I'm presenting patterns. The proof is in the process. And if you let me, I'll show you how to end this in 48 hours. The room fell into charged silence. Catherine, silent until now, finally looked at the others. "He doesn't need your trust, just your attention." Over the next 20 minutes, Harris broke down the sabotage into military-style phases. 1. Infiltration, subtle diversions in shipping expenses and supplier costs. 2. Misdirection, planting rumors to decrease investor confidence. 3. Sabotage, delaying key product rollouts under the guise of technical issues. He used no business jargon, just clarity, strategy, insight. And suddenly, the language that once alienated him became the very bridge between silence and leadership. At one point, Catherine, arms crossed, lips parted in awe, leaned slightly toward him like a student soaking up every word. It didn't go unnoticed. Neither did the change in the boardroom's energy. Preston tried to regain control. "Even if you're right, Harris, you're not qualified to lead a financial recovery. You're a janitor." Harris stepped forward. "No, I'm a father." The room blinked. "And every day I strategize with the most unpredictable human force on this planet, a 9-year-old with too many questions and too much compassion. I've built battle plans in war zones and bedtime routines in one-bedroom apartments. And you think I can't see through a profit-loss statement designed to confuse?" No one laughed, because suddenly no one dared. Harris let the silence land. Then he placed the tin box in front of Preston. "You don't have to believe me. But inside this box are every plan I ever made that saved lives, not profits. Take them. Read them. Then tell me if your current strategy feels safer." Preston stared, but didn't reach for it. Catherine's voice broke the standstill. "We're not asking you to replace anyone. We're asking for permission to listen to someone who sees what we can't." Another board member, an older woman who had remained quiet, spoke for the first time. "Let him lead the counter-strategy team. Temporary role. 1 week. We owe the company that. Preston scowled. And what if he fails? Harris didn't flinch. Then you've lost nothing. I'll mop your floors again and vanish. The older woman turned to the room. Let's vote. Catherine leaned against the wall, heart pounding, the adrenaline of survival slowly giving way to something softer. Harris emerged beside her. She didn't say anything at first. Just looked at him. Really looked. You know, when I first saw you mopping the marble in the lobby, I thought, what a waste. He gave her a half smile. And now I think you might be the only person in this building who actually knows how to clean up a mess. They both laughed. Quiet, full, human. Then Catherine offered her hand, not as a CEO, but as an equal. Welcome to the war room, Mr. Hale. He didn't shake it. He placed his hand over hers and nodded. The boardroom just moments earlier, a cauldron of tension had grown still. Harris stood near the whiteboard, his hands calm at his sides. The battlefield-style diagrams behind him had stunned even the most seasoned minds in the room. But it wasn't the strategy that lingered. It was the clarity, the humility, the calm power that came from knowing who you are when no one else does. The members murmured in hushed tones, trading glances, until one chair creaked loudly, cutting through the silence. It was Edwin Morrow. Silver-haired glasses tucked into the breast pocket of his blazer, Edwin had sat quiet throughout the entire meeting. He was one of the oldest board members, semi-retired, but still deeply respected. Most knew him for his cold efficiency and his skepticism toward anyone who hadn't earned their place through blood sweat and quarterly earnings. But now he rose slowly, the room holding its breath. Edwin stepped forward, eyes fixed not on Catherine, but on Harris. I know this man, he said. Voice gravelly but steady. A flicker of confusion passed among the board. Catherine turned, slightly puzzled. I was 21, Edwin continued. A brash cadet in a joint civilian-military leadership initiative at Quantico. Back then I thought I knew everything. Numbers, tactics, metrics. But one guest lecturer changed how I saw the world. He pointed at Harris, a faint emotion building behind his voice. He didn't talk about war the way others did. He spoke about people, about timing, about listening more than commanding. He said a good strategist saves resources, but a great one saves lives. Edwin paused, and I never forgot that. The room was silent, utterly reverently silent. Even Preston, ever combative, said nothing. Edwin turned to the others. You called him a janitor. But for me, he was the first man who taught me that leadership is not about titles. It's about what you see when everyone else looks away. He looked back at Harris. You didn't recognize me, sir. And I understand. But I owe much of who I became to the way you made that room of arrogant young minds feel. Like they mattered. Like we could lead with integrity. Edwin's voice cracked just slightly. It's an honor to be in your presence again. He offered a subtle bow, nothing exaggerated, just a warrior's nod to another. And just like that, the entire atmosphere shifted. The ripple effect was instantaneous. One board member straightened in her seat, as if reevaluating everything. Another lowered his tablet, no longer looking for flaws in Harris's logic, but listening for wisdom. Even Catherine felt something loosen inside her, a thread pulling at the tight knots she hadn't known she was holding. She looked at Harris, now framed, not as a janitor nor a veteran, but as a man quietly seen for who he truly was. She had built an empire on meritocracy, on performance, on being the sharpest voice in the room. But now the voice reshaping her company came from someone who hadn't spoken a single word until absolutely necessary. And when he did, the room leaned in. That night, long after the meeting ended and the boardroom lights dimmed, Catherine sat in her office alone. She stood by the large window overlooking the city lights that blurred like stars, fallen too close to earth. In her hands was a thin dog-eared book, The Mind at War, written years ago anonymously by a former military strategist. It had been her favorite in college, a source of resilience when the world saw her as nothing more than a poor girl from the Bronx with big dreams and empty pockets. She never knew the author. Until now. Because tucked inside the tin box Harris had left behind, symbolically, intentionally, was a faded note in the same handwriting. Her breath caught. All this time. She looked across the room at the framed magazine covers featuring her own face. Forbes' Fortune. The Atlantic, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel power. She felt distance. Who had she become? The girl who once waited tables to pay for textbooks, who skipped meals to attend networking events, who spent her nights in public libraries and her mornings cold-pitching venture capitalists. She had built Catherine Wynne, the CEO. But Catherine Wynne, the human. She had buried her under schedules, spreadsheets, and a need to never be underestimated again. Now here stood a man who had been underestimated by everyone, and yet carried no resentment, no ego, just quiet strength and a deep well of something she couldn't name, maybe grace. And his daughter Ava, with eyes too bright for this weary world, had seen through her from the beginning. Not with judgment, but curiosity, compassion. Catherine closed her eyes. A single tear traced down her cheek, not from sadness, but from recognition. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from an unknown number. It was Harris. "Thank you for letting me speak. That was more than most people ever do." She stared at the words for a long moment, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she typed, "I didn't let you speak. You earned it." She paused, then added, "And maybe it's time I listened more." Harris sat beside Ava, who was fast asleep under a blanket of stars, projected onto the ceiling, a gift from Catherine. He watched her chest rise and fall, that serene rhythm only children knew. Beside him sat the tin box. He hadn't planned to bring it today. But something in Ava's eyes this morning, her certainty that people need to see who you really are, Daddy had compelled him to take it along. He smiled softly. He wasn't invisible anymore. And maybe, just maybe, the world was finally ready to listen. The afternoon sun spilled over the city like warm honey, softening its edges and slowing its pace. Harris had chosen the park carefully, just a few blocks from Catherine's office, but a world apart in spirit. Towering trees stood like sentinels of peace. A carousel spun in the distance, its music faint but cheerful. Ducks skated lazily across a glinting pond. A wooden bench beneath an old sycamore waited for them. And for once, Catherine Wynne, billionaire boardroom tactician, master of precision, wasn't leading anything. She simply followed. There was no fanfare. Just 3 neatly wrapped sandwiches, a paper bag of apple slices, and a thermos of warm chamomile tea that Ava had insisted on packing. Catherine held her sandwich awkwardly, as if unsure whether to dissect it or frame it. She glanced sideways. Harris was already halfway through his content, elbows on knees. Ava had unwrapped hers with clinical precision, now munching cheerfully and watching squirrels battle over a peanut. It was foreign and oddly disarming. "Thank you," Catherine said at last, her voice more vulnerable than she intended, "for inviting me." "We didn't invite you," Ava said without looking up. "We included you." Harris smothered a grin behind his tea. Catherine blinked. "Right. My mistake." Then, as if some invisible barrier cracked, she laughed, a breathy, quiet sound, almost involuntary. Ava looked up, surprised. "You have a nice laugh," she offered. Catherine tilted her head. "I'm not sure I've heard it in years." They sat in silence for a while. But it wasn't the sterile silence of corporate meetings or awkward social obligation. It was restful. Harris reached down to pluck a dry leaf from Ava's sock. She leaned her head gently against his arm. Catherine watched the gesture, something delicate stirring in her chest, something wordless. She had spent so long inside glass towers and armored cars, surrounded by people who wanted pieces of her. And now, on this simple park bench, two people sat beside her, who wanted nothing, yet somehow gave her everything she hadn't realized she missed. "Do you want to play with us?" Ava asked, suddenly finishing her apple slice. Catherine blinked. "Play jump rope." The CEO looked down at her stiletto heels, then at the child's wide grin, then at the innocent coil of pink nylon rope in Ava's hand. "I don't know if I remember how." "You don't have to remember," Ava replied. "Just try." Something about the way she said it, so trusting, so inviting, unlocked a long-forgotten memory. Catherine barefoot on a cracked Bronx sidewalk, her younger self, counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, as her friends twirled the rope. Before ambition replaced afternoons. Before the world expected her to be more than a girl with scraped knees and endless dreams. She stood up, hesitated, and slipped off her heels. The grass felt cool beneath her feet. "All right," she whispered more to herself than to them. "Let's try." At first she stumbled awkward, too measured. Then Ava called out the rhythm. "Ready, 1, 2, 3. Catherine jumped, once, then again, and again. Her arms flailed, her bun loosened, but she was laughing freely, heartily, not the tight, calculated smile of press releases or earnings calls, but the kind of laugh that startled even the birds from the trees. Harris, watching nearby, felt something shift, not just in her, but in him. He wasn't used to watching people change in real time. But Catherine was changing, not reinventing, remembering. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and golden light painted everything with softness, Ava walked ahead chasing shadows with a stick. Catherine stood beside Harris, quiet, now her chest still rising with the echo of laughter. Then, unexpectedly, she turned to Ava and called out, "May I ask you something?" Ava stopped. "Sure." Catherine stepped forward slowly, and without pretense, without theater, bent slightly at the waist. A half bow, a gesture of respect, from a woman who'd spent her life being bowed to. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for reminding me how to live." Ava looked confused at first, then smiled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "You're welcome," she said simply. Catherine rose. The moment hung in the air like a lantern, small, glowing, unforgettable. They walked home slowly, the three of them. No one called it a beginning. No one labeled anything. But as Harris opened the car door for her, Catherine lingered just a second longer. "Would you be willing to join us again sometime?" she asked. "Not for work. Just this." Harris met her eyes. There was no romance in it, yet just an understanding, a trust forged in quiet dignity. "We'd like that," he said. Catherine stepped inside the car, her eyes catching Ava's through the rearview mirror. The girl waved. Catherine waved back, heart light. Some connections are forged in fire, explosive, consuming. Others are born in silence, nurtured in trust, and flicker gently like a spark that refuses to die. Catherine didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to finding out. The morning unfolded like a scene from a storm-churned sea, still on the surface, treacherous underneath. Catherine stood behind a podium at the company's headquarters, the skyline of downtown reflecting behind her like glass ghosts. Reporters crowded below, murmuring with the blood-scented curiosity of wolves. The massive screen behind her blinked with the headline, "WinCorp under investigation, veteran janitor accused of corporate espionage." It wasn't just absurd, it was surgical, and Catherine knew exactly who had wielded the scalpel. Vincent Harrow, chief financial advisor. A man with salt and pepper hair designer suits and a smile that always arrived half a second too early. He had been with Catherine since her second acquisition, sat beside her during shareholder battles, whispered advice during boardroom deadlocks. She'd trusted him with everything until now. The anonymous tip, the forged financial directive, the evidence tying Harris to a fake offshore account signed under Catherine's digital authorization. It was elegant, cold, and almost perfect. That's all Harris said when internal security brought him into the glass interrogation room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, didn't try to argue. He simply placed his hands calmly on the table, looked Catherine in the eyes, and repeated, "I didn't do this." And Catherine, despite the whirlwind of press, the pressure from the board, the screaming attorneys, felt something crack deep inside her. Because she believed him. More than Vincent, more than data, more than herself. She had been prepped to speak. Her legal team had written a full statement of condemnation to distance the company from Harris, precise, cold, reputation safe. She didn't read it. Instead, she stood at the podium, eyes steady, heart in her throat. The cameras blinked, microphones tilted forward, reporters poised with venom-tipped pens. And Catherine Wynne, media-hardened Forbes. Hardened took a breath and said nothing. Seconds passed, a few chuckles in the back, a cough. The air thickened with tension. Then in a voice soft but clear, she simply said, "I choose to listen." As the hours passed, the cracks widened. A whistleblower email arrived, unsigned but damning. It referenced a buried clause in Vincent's old contracts, one granting him override access to Catherine's authorizations under emergency clauses. Only two people in the world knew that clause existed: Catherine and Vincent. At 3:43 p.m., Vincent tried to resign due to personal health reasons. By 4:15, federal investigators were reviewing WinCorp servers. By 5:00, Catherine watched her empire, once the symbol of her unshakable will, begin to burn at the edges. They met that evening in the office, just the three of them. Catherine, Harris, Ava. No lawyers, no media, just raw human silence. "You should walk away," Harris said. Voice even. "This storm will swallow everything." Catherine shook her head. "Then I'll stand in it beside you." She stepped closer, but not as a CEO, not even as a woman trying to make things right. She stepped closer as someone who had finally understood the price of pride. "I believed the system more than I believed the man who saved my company, who taught my daughter compassion, who never once asked for anything." Harris didn't respond, but Ava reached up and touched her hand gently. "We believe you too," she whispered. "The board wanted a public scapegoat. That was the old way. But Catherine didn't give them what they wanted. She held a second press conference, this time with Harris at her side. This company failed someone who showed it. Grace. "That failure is mine," she said, voice unwavering. "We live in a culture that only sees worth in titles and suits. Today I challenge that. Harris is not just innocent. He is the reason WinCorp still exists." The press erupted. But Catherine didn't flinch, because for the first time in her life she wasn't protecting power. She was protecting truth. It was poetic. Vincent was led out in handcuffs past the same reporters he used to smirk at. He never made eye contact with Catherine or Harris. But it didn't matter anymore, because justice didn't need a spotlight, just a moment of courage. And that moment had come. 2 days later, Harris returned not as janitor nor as advisor, but as Catherine's equal. He wore the same weathered army green jacket, the same quiet eyes. But now people stood when he entered the room, because something had shifted, not in him, but in them. That night, the three of them stood on the rooftop of the office building's city lights, glowing like a constellation of second chances. Ava leaned against her father. Catherine stood beside him, her hands gripping the ledge. You know, she murmured this fall could have destroyed everything. It still might, Harris replied. But it didn't, Ava chimed in, because we didn't let it. They watched the skyline. Somewhere below, the city pulsed with noise. But up here, peace. Catherine turned to Harris, voice soft. Will you stay? He looked out over the horizon, then at his daughter, and finally at her. I will. The ballroom shimmered with light, but the air inside was taut uncertain. WinCorp's annual investor summit had never seen this many cameras. News vans lined the street. Every seat in the grand hall was filled, not just by shareholders, but by critics, skeptics, and curiosity chasers hungry for scandal. On stage, a solitary chair sat next to the podium meant for Catherine. But she wasn't alone tonight. Harris stood just behind the curtain, silent in his dark blazer, the lines on his face betraying more weariness than usual. The scars of the recent storm still clung to him, not in shame, but in the quiet way good men carry in justice. Next to him stood Ava, 9 years old, wearing a simple white dress, holding a note card too big for her tiny hands. Are you sure? Harris whispered, crouching beside her. Ava looked up, eyes calm. She needs someone to speak the truth, she said softly, nodding toward the podium. And they'll listen if it comes from me. Catherine, watching nearby, felt something tighten in her chest. This little girl, his daughter, had the steady composure of a seasoned diplomat, and something more, a kind of light that couldn't be trained, only lived. The MC's voice echoed through the chamber. And now, before we resume with board updates, there is a special request. A hush rippled across the crowd as Ava stepped onto the stage. At first there was confusion. A child. Here, but Ava didn't flinch. She walked up to the microphone with grace well beyond her years, stood on her toes, and adjusted it slightly downward. Then silence. Then her voice. My name is Ava Hale. I'm 9. I wasn't supposed to talk today, but I asked if I could say something. For my dad. Murmurs. She smiled politely at the crowd, then glanced at Catherine and Harris in the wings, both motionless. You all know him as Harris Hale. Some of you may have read things in the news, or seen headlines that made him look like a problem. She paused. But to me, he's the answer. The room stilled. He's the reason I get to go to school. The reason I know how to tie my shoes, solve math puzzles, and pronounce big words like altruism. A few light chuckles. Nervous. Soft. When I was 5, Ava continued, we used to live near a tiny library. It was old, and sometimes it rained inside. But Dad would take me every week, and we'd sit by the back wall with a blanket and read. Her eyes gleamed distant in memory. I thought we were rich because we had books and stories, and he made it feel like magic. Only later did I realize he skipped meals just so I'd have a warm dinner after. Whispers now faded. Reporters stopped typing. No one moved. Ava's voice softened. He never told me to be brave. He just was. Every single day. She looked down briefly at her note card, then folded it and set it aside. I'm not saying all this because I want to make anyone feel bad. I'm saying it because I think grown-ups sometimes forget what real honor looks like. She turned, slightly locking eyes with her father now. He taught me what honor means, not with words, but with how he lives. The ballroom stood silent. Even the chandelier seemed to dim. Catherine's hand went to her mouth. She blinked rapidly, but the tears broke through. Across the room, executives, analysts, and cold-faced board members sat as if a veil had been lifted. The men who once dismissed Harris as a janitor now stared at his daughter, shattered by the clarity of her conviction. A single pair of hands began to clap, then another. Then the whole room. Ava stepped back, bowed her head, and quietly walked off stage. Harris knelt to meet her. He didn't say a word, just held her in his arms. Ava whispered against his chest. Was that okay? Harris swallowed his throat thick. That was everything. Catherine stepped forward, her face still streaked with tears. She crouched beside Ava, looked into her eyes, and without grandeur or pretense, took Ava's small hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said. "You reminded the world of something we forgot." Ava looked up, curious. "What's that?" "That the strongest voice," Catherine whispered, "is the one that speaks with love." As they exited the hall, dozens of staff members and guests had gathered in the lobby, not by command, but by instinct. As Ava walked through hand in hand with her father and Catherine, the crowd erupted, once more applause echoing through the marble walls like thunder. No one asked them to stand. They simply couldn't sit anymore. For once, the world didn't see a janitor, or a child, or a CEO. They saw a family, a symbol, a story rewritten by love, truth, and a little girl who did the unthinkable, not by fighting louder, but by loving deeper. The rain had stopped, not just outside the marble towers of WinCorp headquarters, but in the air between people. The tension, the doubt of the haze of suspicion that had clouded the past weeks, was finally lifting. Justice was unfolding, and it didn't need to roar. News of Victor Sloan's arrest broke mid-morning. The once praised CFO, polished and silver-tongued, was let out of the building in cuffs, expression, blank eyes, hollow. His betrayal had been layered, precise, forged reports, hidden offshore flows, a fabricated document pinning blame on Harris and implicating Catherine. But the paper trail, digital footprints, and a courageous whistleblower finally brought it all to light. There were no cheers in the lobby, no smug faces or vengeance-soaked stares. Only silence, the kind that comes when truth arrives late but undeniable. Catherine Wynne entered the boardroom that afternoon, not as the embattled CEO, nor the untouchable billionaire. She walked in as herself, tired, changed, and real. Every seat was filled. The same room where her voice once reigned with authority was now charged with something else. Reverence. Because she hadn't fought back with press releases or legal muscle. She had waited. She had listened. And she had let a little girl speak truth. She stood at the head of the table, took a breath, and looked toward the man sitting near the window, simple navy shirt, no title plate, no entourage. Harris Hale. I once believed leadership was about being. First, Catherine began her voice, firm but warm. First to speak. First to act. First to decide. She looked down, then back up. But I was wrong. There are leaders you hire, and then there are leaders you find when you are wise enough to listen. She turned. To Harris Hale, the man who came to this company not with a resume but with integrity, who didn't ask for power but used what little he had to lift others. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Some nodded. A few wiped away emotion they weren't ready to name. Catherine stepped forward with a slender silver folder in hand. This is a resolution signed by every member of this board. Effective immediately, Harris Hale is appointed Honorary Senior Advisor to WinCorp in perpetuity. A seat, a voice, and the full weight of our gratitude. She offered it to him, but Harris didn't take it. He looked at the document, then up at her, and smiled gently. The same smile he gave Ava after every spelling bee. The one he gave strangers who needed directions. The one that said, "It's okay." I didn't do this for applause. He rose slowly. "I'm honored," he said softly, his voice carrying farther than volume alone ever could. "But I can't accept." A pause. The room froze. Catherine's brows knit. I didn't step in to earn a title. I stepped in because something needed to be made right. He looked around, not with pride, but peace. What I gave, he said, voice steady now, was never to be owed back. Just pass it forward? Silence, the kind that breaks you gently. Then someone stood, followed by another, until the whole room, executives, assistants, board members, were on their feet, not clapping, just standing, like witnesses at something sacred. Later that evening, as the sun melted behind the skyline, Harris stepped out of the building with Ava by his side, her small hand gripping his, the folder unopened in his bag. Catherine caught up behind them. "Harris," she called, slightly out of breath. "At least let us throw you a dinner, or a ceremony. Something." He chuckled. "Not really my thing." She smiled, then knelt beside Ava. "I think your father is the first man I've ever met who made the whole world stand still, by choosing to walk away." Ava giggled. "He does that a lot." Catherine looked up at Harris. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't nod, didn't brush it off. He just looked her in the eyes and held the moment. "You're welcome." And then he extended his hand. Not a shake, a passing, a gesture that said, "It's your turn now." Inside the WinCorp building, the day rolled on. But something fundamental had shifted. In the lobby, employees gathered around their screens, not for stock prices or breaking news, but to replay one clip on loop, a little girl saying, "He taught me what honor means," and a father who walked in as a janitor walking out as something far greater. Not a title, not a hero, but a man who proved that dignity once lived needs no defense. The restaurant hadn't changed much. The same creaky wooden sign above the entrance, the familiar scent of rosemary and firewood, the quiet hum of soft jazz playing from a scratched speaker behind the bar. But for the three people walking through its doors tonight, everything had changed. The hostess recognized Catherine first, though not in her usual polished power suit, not surrounded by a security detail or assistants. Tonight she wore a simple navy dress, hair down, smile unguarded. She looked real. And beside her was Harris in his well-worn button-down and calm, steady presence that needed no fanfare. His hand gently rested on Ava's shoulder as she tiptoed to peer at the dessert menu by the entrance. They were guided to the same table Harris and Ava used to sit at, back when every meal was split and every dollar counted. Tonight they had the table to themselves. The waiter placed a candle between them. The flame flickered gently. Catherine watched it, her gaze softening. "It's strange," she whispered. "This place used to make me feel superior. Now it just feels like home." They didn't talk about numbers, or titles, or headlines. They talked about music, about Ava's drawings, about the lasagna that Catherine admitted she had never tried before until tonight. Harris poured water into her glass. "You've really never had lasagna from here?" She chuckled. There wasn't time for comfort food, not back then. He nodded. And now she looked at him, not past him, at him. Now I realize, comfort is everything. Ava swung her legs under the table and asked matter-of-factly, "So, are you two dating now, or still pretending not to notice?" Both adults froze. Then laughter. Warm, real, unguarded laughter that echoed softly through the restaurant. A few patrons glanced over, smiling. One older couple even nodded approvingly. Catherine leaned closer to Ava, lowering her voice dramatically. "What if I said I'd like to apply for the position?" Ava raised a brow. "I'm the hiring manager." They laughed again. When the plates were cleared and the candle burned lower, Catherine's hand quietly reached across the table. It landed on Harris's, not grasping, just resting. As if saying, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He looked down at her fingers, so often used to sign million-dollar contracts and point in boardrooms. Tonight they were simply human, vulnerable, warm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sometimes words only get in the way of what's already known. Later, as dessert was served, a slice of tiramisu Ava ordered for the table. But mostly for me, Catherine broke the comfortable silence. "Do you know what scared me the most?" she asked quietly. It wasn't losing the company, or the headlines. It was realizing I had no one to call when it all crumbled. Harris listened. I'd built walls so high I couldn't see the ground anymore. You and Ava, you didn't just walk in. You brought me back down to where people live, where hearts breathe. Ava wiped chocolate from her chin. "You mean, like real people?" Catherine smiled. "Exactly like real people." The bill came. Harris reached for it. Catherine did too. They paused. Ava grabbed it. "Guys, please. You're both embarrassing." And then with a sparkle in her eyes, she leaned back and asked with a voice full of mock innocence, but eyes that saw more than her age ever should, should I start calling her Mom? Catherine's lips parted. Stunned. Harris froze, but not in fear, more like someone whose heart had just been touched by something too pure to react quickly. Then Catherine laughed. And this time, it was the kind of laugh that shook off years, that made the waiter glance over and smile, that made Ava clap her hands in triumph. "No rush," Catherine said gently. "Only if it ever feels right." Ava tilted her head. It already does. Outside the window, night had fallen. Street lamps cast golden circles onto the sidewalk. Inside, the flame on their table still danced undisturbed. No dramatic music. No applause. Just laughter. Just presence. Just three people who had once been lost in different ways, finding each other around one small table under one small light. As the scene slowly dims, the camera pulls back. We catch one last image, Catherine's hand still resting on Harris's. Ava nestled between them eyes, sleepy smile peaceful. And beneath it all, a voiceover, not from a character, but from the soul of the story. Sometimes the unthinkable is just kindness done when no one's watching. Where are you watching from today? We love hearing from kind souls all around the world, so feel free to share a bit about yourself in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story. We release heartfelt tales like this every week, gentle reminders of hope, love, and the quiet strength inside us all. Thank you, truly, for spending time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and take care of each other.